I'm very pleased to be joined here today with the very talented writer Imran Mahmood. Imran, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'll be moderating a discussion talking about Imran's first book, You Don't Know Me, and his subsequent work as well, along with maybe a few questions about his writing life. But to introduce him, he's a practicing barrister with 30 years experience fighting cases in courtrooms across the country in the UK. His debut novel, You Don't Know Me, was chosen by Simon Mayo as a BBC Radio 2 Book Club choice for 2017. And it was listed for Theakston Crime Novel of the Year and for the CWA Gold Dagger Award. It was also made into a hugely successful BBC One adaptation in association with Netflix, which we're going to certainly talk about. His second novel, I Know What I Saw, was released in June 2021 and was also chosen as a Sunday Times Crime Novel of the Month and reached number 2 on the Audible charts. It has also been longlisted for the CWA Gold Dagger Award this year as well, so congratulations on that. He has been commissioned to write 3 screenplays and is now working on his next novel. His third novel, which I can tell you now is also very excellent, All I Said Was True, is out in July this year. When not in court or writing novels or screenplays or, saving the world, he can sometimes be found on the Red Hot Chili Writers podcast as one of our regular contributors. He hails from Liverpool, but now lives in London with his wife and daughters. Imran, welcome.
What a fantastic introduction. I've never had one.
Well, you wrote it yourself. It's your autobiography. But I mean, it's just incredible how much you've achieved in terms of your literary career, but also in terms of screenwriting in the short time that you've been a writer. But I'm gonna get to your journey as a writer. I just first want to ask you about You Don't Know Me. It's a book that has hooked readers, myself included, and I guess part of that is, what was the journey in terms of writing that and coming from obviously your criminal law background, how that fed in to the idea for this hugely successful novel?
What a fantastic question. So for those who don't know the premise of it, it's a You Don't Know Me is a story told in the first person by a young man, in fact a young black man, who is working class, and he is on trial for murder. And just at the crucial moment, he sacks his barrister, and then he's left to do his own closing speech. And that's a kind of tactical move by him because he wants to do his own speech. And then the book is his speech to the jury. And what he's saying is, look, I know there's all of this evidence which stands against me, but for reasons which I'll explain, I am not guilty. Come and take a walk with me in my shoes, and I'll explain exactly why I had the gun, exactly why I was taking this journey, exactly why my DNA is in the car. So that's the basic premise. It's a defendant doing his own closing speech. And what had happened with me was I was in court when I had the idea for this, and I was in the roping room. I think I was writing a speech myself for in a murder case, a defense speech. And I remember as I was going through the roping room, which is a place where we can kind of put our wigs and gowns on and everything else and have some space to write, I was passing another courtroom, and outside that courtroom was a man who was just in the process of telling his barrister that he was useless. And he said to him, what's the point of you? I don't need you anyway. And then off he went. And I thought, I wonder what it would be like if a defendant had decided to do his own speech. If he didn't need me and I was sacked, what would that speech sound like? What would be things that he would find important compared to what I would find important? So I do a speech, I like to concentrate on the evidence, on facts, on the kind of strategic outcomes. I can only say things which have evolved in the case from the evidence. I can't make things up.
Mm.
And I can use, the kind of oratory skills we develop over time to try and put the case. But a defendant, I thought, would really not want to do any of that. What he wants to do is to say, come and understand me by understanding my life, which might be completely different from yours. You might not have an experience where your father leaves home when you're a baby. You might not have the experience of living from hand to mouth, and you might not have the experience of being approached by gangs day in, day out, wanting to seduce you into gang life and into drugs and violence and so on. And so that's a rather long-winded answer to your question.
But it's really interesting because you brought the very emotive element of the work that you do into this book. And was that important to you in terms of trying to give a voice, and I don't mean to sound worthy, but also trying to give a voice and a real sense of history of the way that some of the clients that you've seen suffer, and the sort of realities that you've experienced via the lens as a barrister? And was that part of the impetus to write?
Yeah, definitely, because the defendant in that book is unnamed. He doesn't have he's never referred to by name because he's talking, and you don't often talk about yourself in the third person. And so, but I wanted to keep him as unnamed so that we could have somebody who represented an everyman. He's there to represent features of every defendant, or many defendants who go through the system. And one of the things we realise, and our experience tells us, that people who are wealthy and from privileged backgrounds tend not to commit certain types of crime. They tend not to be involved in violence. They tend not to be involved in dealing drugs on the street. They occasionally get themselves involved in other kinds of crime, but not this kind of crime. And by far, the kind of the crimes which are punished most heavily are often crimes of violence and crimes of drugs. And I wanted to know, what was it about the situations that people who are already living in deprived circumstances, what was it about those pressures that meant that the kind of journey into criminality was almost inevitable? And it felt, watching it from a distance, as though there was almost nothing that you could do. They were on rails, and it just took a push, and they were going to make this journey and a descent into criminality, no matter what, because they were surrounded by it, because they didn't have structures which took them away from it, because they had very high aspirations. So it's a kind of culture it's a highly aspirational culture, whether it's because of images from music or images from TV or whatever it is. And so you've given these young people all of these kind of wishes to fulfill, but none of the tools to fulfill them. And so what they do, they end up going into drugs, and they go into gangs. And I just wanted to shine a light on that and say, look, this might be happening behind closed doors, and you might not know what it's like when you go onto an estate, because you've probably never been there, or your life doesn't take you into those quarters. But it's important that this is what our criminal justice system is dealing with.
It seems to me like it's an indictment upon the system, and just how unjust it is. And like you say, it's shining a light to others in terms of that. And I think perhaps that's why it was snapped up for adaptation, because it's something that a lot of people recognize, a lot of people want to change. And so it aired recently in November, December, was it, last year, on BBC, and is now available on Netflix as well. And it had an amazing viewing of like 9 million people when it came out, which is incredible. And, it's a moment that so many authors dream about. What was that like for you, seeing what you had written now being adapted for the screen? And, what was your reaction to it?
Well, the effect of it has been kind of has increased as time has gone on. Because when I was first, because it was my debut novel, and it was optioned by a TV company, and that felt at that time felt quite normal. And I think that's not that normal, but it's not that rare.
Yeah.
For novels. And then I just expected it was the next stages were going to happen, that it was going to be greenlit, and that a channel would buy it, and that it would be made, and so on. And it was only kind of 5 years on, and when I talked to other authors, that I realised that was actually really rare, that didn't happen. So I was lucky, and I'm realising more and more how lucky I was. I was lucky in so many ways, and one of the ways was we got a really good production company, we got a really good screenwriter, and we got excellent actors to act it. So you put all of those ingredients together, and it becomes like a kind of, and I have, in a way, I have nothing to do with it. I'm really just an observer. I mean, yes, it starts off as my book, and the premise is mine, but almost nothing else is. A lot of the dialogue isn't mine. Some of it is, but it's all imagined by Tom Edge, who wrote the screenplay. And I often think when I look at it that I was lucky. It could have gone the other way. It could have been an adaptation which went wrong, and I could have been sitting there on the sidelines asking myself, what on earth had happened, and why it was so bad. But it was, I was very pleased with it when I watched it. I thought it kind of blew me away. And what was quite surreal was when I went onto set and I met the actors, and they would say, "Oh, I'm Kyra," or "I'm Bless," or "I'm playing a hero," which is the name they gave to the main character because he's our hero. And then I would watch them being filmed, and they would be saying things, and they would be in situations that I had created in my head. That was really surreal because I was now meeting in real flesh and blood people I'd only kind of imagined, and who to me weren't as flesh and blood as they are when they're shaking your hand. So that was really surreal, and it was lovely to be on set, and all of those experiences of being taken on set, being shown around, speaking to people who say, "Look, everything that's glass in here is made of sugar," because it's, especially if it needs to be smashed on somebody's head, or these are the fight scenes. This scene is filmed by drones. This is what's happening here. So all of that was amazing, and I've just been invited to the BAFTAs, which is our TV and Film Awards, which is amazing. I never thought for a second when I started my career at the bar that I'd end up invited to where the lovelies hang out.
Yeah, I mean it's quite an incredible journey, and actually that was your first book, and you've had another book published subsequent to that, and you've got your third one coming out in July. And what's interesting about all three of your books is just the evolution you can see from you as a writer. I like the way you do explore this idea, the concept of the unreliable narrator in all your books, in fact, because it's the jury to trust your main character, and you don't know me as you're not. And then you've got two very psychologically complex journeys in your subsequent books from the main characters. And so can you talk a bit about the evolution of your literary style and how you feel like your writing has, for me, when I read your books, I see you going from strength to strength, and how that's sort of come about?
Well, so I've always been fascinated by the idea of an unreliable narrator, and we had to have one in You Don't Know Me because he's on trial, and really it's the reader that's the jury, and they decide. And in fact, they decide whether he is unreliable or not. I mean, he may not be. He may be totally reliable. And then I don't know. I think it occurred to me that the unreliable narrator form is the most natural form, I think. And the reason for that is we are unreliable as human beings. We lie. This is something we are acutely aware of in court. We're so aware of it, and whenever we want to hear from a witness, we make him swear an oath on the Bible or on the Quran or an affirmation to say that they're promising to tell the truth, which is bizarre if you think about it. That you've got to force people to say, I know we all lie, but this time, for this short time that you're standing in court, you have to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. And even then, they don't. Even juries are made to take an oath where they say they will try the evidence, if they try the case on based on the evidence, and give a true verdict. So even they, the courtroom understands that they will lie, and then I think, well, what is unreliable? It isn't just a question of whether something is a lie or a truth, but it's whether or not the truth that is being told is a real truth. And one of the things that we found in courtrooms up and down the country when we're trying cases is that if you've got let's say you've got a murder and it's witnessed, or an assault and it's witnessed by 5 people, those 5 people will come to court and give all of them completely different accounts. There'll be some similarities, but quite a lot of them will be different. But they all believe what they say. You can have a situation where they do all believe what they say, and it'll all be different. So then what emerges is this concept of either changing truths or a number of different truths for the same event. And then you wind that back and you understand that comes from memory. And what really is memory other than the thing which forms our personality? So we walk around, we have these experiences, and we remember what we do, and that all over time layers into our complex personality. And then I thought, what happens if we start to lose our memory, or our memories fray? What does that make us? Does that change our personalities? And then there are those memories which we know we have, but we suppress them. And if you've got repressed memory syndrome, it could be that you have discharged this memory completely because you don't like what that means for you as a person, what that means for you. So you discard either the ones which don't fit with your ego and your persona, or the ones that you can't rationalize. And that happens to people who are the victims of abuse quite a lot. They repressed memories. And then there's a whole other thing, false memory, where people haven't got a memory, like a real memory of something, but they have a kind of real memory in their mind. Your brain has formed a memory. So for me, those are the right areas for discussion. We need to look at, that's the human part of this story for me.
You kind of stepped on my next question there, but that's okay, because what you've actually talked a bit about as well, or hinted towards, is just this unraveling of a history which works in parallel with the unraveling of the character in the book. And so there's that lovely sort of juxtaposition working alongside one another. So one of the questions I'd like to ask you, actually, as an author of Pakistani heritage, with a very Pakistani name, I find it quite interesting because I don't know if people are aware, but there's a lot of talk in publishing about diversity and representation. And one of the things I actually love about your book is that none of that comes into play. You don't really talk about identity. You don't really talk about race. You don't talk about, concepts of home and belonging. You just write really great, psychologically complex characters. And is that something that you were intent on doing when you first started out, or have you just naturally decided to subvert everyone's expectations in terms of, his name is Imran, he's probably going to write about brown things? Is that something you did intentionally?
If I'm totally honest,
you do like to be contrary, don't you?
Well, that's quite a good observation. I am very contrary. I think very many people with the name Imran, I think, are contrary. I think it goes with the territory. So for me, I've never really been that conscious when I've been writing the book that the books are not very definitely featuring Asian characters or Pakistani characters or people of Pakistani heritage. Because for me, what's paramount is the story, and you need, for me, I have to have the characters which best tell the story. And so, if I'm telling a story about discrimination in the criminal justice system and people who are marginalised and who are ripe for being preyed on by gangs, drug gangs, then I'm going to have a young black male as my protagonist because he's the one that can best tell that story. And the same for in my second book, I know what I saw. We've got the story of a middle-aged, middle-class white man who's been to Oxford or one of the Oxbridge universities. So who can best tell that story and the unraveling that causes, but a white man? Because yes, you know, I can have an Asian character who goes to the university, but that doesn't best represent that, you know, the character who has these events before him. That character is a white character, and in the third book, I used a character in All I Said Was True. I used a character who's mixed race, so who has Pakistani heritage. But because it served the story, because in the course of that, I wanted to explore not just, you know, identity as a theme, but identity in circumstances where identity is pulling a character in two separate ways. So you've got, so she's partly Irish, and her mother is Irish, and so she has those influences in her day-to-day life. But on the other side of it, her father's Pakistani and has disappeared off back to Pakistan. And what does that mean for her sense of being in the United Kingdom, particularly when he's gone back because he didn't feel as if he were properly being accepted in the United Kingdom because he didn't feel as if he belonged. And what does that do to the character? How does that make that her persona become slightly more fragile?
But it's done with great subtlety because it doesn't become mired in this obsession with understanding identity. So it's woven in quite naturally. And actually, looking back, all three main characters in your previous books have been so different. You've got a young black man. You've got sort of man in his 30s, 40s, we'd say, a homeless white middle class man, and then you've got a female character. And so you mention how these characters are best placed to tell these stories. And then also, what do you feel is your responsibility, someone who's so far removed from those identities, in terms of telling those stories? And how do you go about trying to make that experience as authentic as possible? Because, I mean, as a writer, we shouldn't be pigeonholed about what stories we should or can and can't tell. And so what things do you do in order to try and step into these characters' shoes and tell those stories from as authentic, whatever that term means, because we could spend a very long time sort of dissecting that word. But yeah. How do you go about trying to ensure that sort of authenticity as far as you can as a writer?
Well, another great question. I think, and we've been through the mill in the UK about this question of cultural appropriation, and it's, you know, and in the States and probably everywhere else as well. It becomes more important, I think, where you are writing characters which aren't the dominant culture, and you are yourself part of the dominant culture. So I think a white man writing about a black man or an Asian man will suffer more criticism than the other way around, and I think for good reason. And that's not to say that they shouldn't write the characters, but they have to do it sympathetically. And I think that's the starting point. You have to look at what you're writing and whether you can tell that story properly, and whether you can tell it sympathetically, and whether you can be alive to the cultural ramifications of the things that you are doing and saying. And I'll give you quite a good example. I hope quite a good example of that. So when they were filming You Don't Know Me, the man who wrote the script is a middle-aged white man, middle class. And he's writing the dialogue of young black people. And not just young black people, but young black people from a bit of central London, which means that they are not just working class, but they're particular underclass. And they speak their own language in a way, because it's their slang, their patois is not accessible to everyone. And so, how does he do that? How does a man who's in his 50s and white and all the rest of it write so well? And the answer is he writes it the best way he can, and then when it's being filmed on the ground, the actors themselves are saying, "We're not sure that we would say that.
Yeah.
This is how we would say it." And he, as tribute to him, and this is why it's a tribute to Tom, is he says, "Great, let's do it the way you would do it," rather than saying, "Well, I'm the dominant person in this relationship. You'll do what I say."
But that's such a collaboration. But when you're writing, when you're writing, you're in isolation, and so how do you go about sort of trying to reconcile that?
Well, I don't think I have to in the same way, because when I'm writing about a white man, it's not a kind of culture which is alien to me. I'm steeped in that culture already, because it's the dominant culture. It's the culture I grew up in, even though I'm not white. It's the culture I know best and which surrounds me.
Yeah.
And when I'm writing about the criminal justice system, I'm writing about people who are trapped in the jaws of the criminal justice system. That's also my reality, because it's something I see every day. I know what it's like for young people in these situations, not because I've lived it. Although, I grew up in a working class household in Liverpool, in a working class area. My father worked in factories. So I understand the working class ethic and the working class roots that some of these people have, but I don't understand the particular pressures of young people today. But I see them all the time, and I see them a lot. So I think I'm okay, because I'm writing about things I know. I think that's quite, people always say, write what you know. And, that's not always, this shouldn't be the thing that confines you in the way that you write. You should be able to branch out. But I think for me, what I take from that phrase is write about things that you can write about with authority, whether it's because you know it or whether it's because you can carry it off.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I noticed that you do the same when you write your books, and when you wrote your recent book, The Movement, which has characters which, at least one of them is a female Pakistani character from Pakistan rather than from Britain. And so you've taken a character which isn't alien to you, but isn't your dominant culture in a way.
Yeah.
You've managed to do that so skillfully, because you are steeped in the culture, even though it's not.
Those authors whose writing really kind of hit you hardest, who would you say are some of your top living or dead authors who inspire you and your writing?
So the dead ones, Harper Lee.
Let's go with the dead ones first. She's dead now.
She's got to be dead. But her book was brought out, I think, posthumously. Her second book.
Right, we're going to have to fact check that. But yes, go on, please.
I think Harper Lee. But and she writes about the Deep South and fictionalizes this world where you've got some horrible stuff happening, that racism is entrenched. There are these clashes. It's a nation going through upheaval and change, and she's right on the cutting. And I love the way that she does that. And what she does so cleverly is that she takes the narrative voice of a child, and we see everything through the lens of this child, the innocence of her viewpoint. And the things that she is saying are so dark and awful. And I think that kind of juxtaposition is the thing which brings that really to life. So she's a kind of hero of mine. It's so awful. And it was.
Let's hope she is dead and not listening to this.
Widely recognised as being awful, not just because it's awful, but because it ruined the first book. Because the characters are the same. The backstory for Atticus Finch makes him very unpleasant. I don't want anything to do with. So, and then living authors. I tell you who I do really admire. They are the writers that I know best. So Abir Mukherjee, who writes about India in the kind of Days of the Raj style, and kind of historical fiction, but with criminal elements. But it's so well kind of researched and so beautifully told. Wasim Khan, who writes about India. Again, he lived in India for a decade, so he knows the country, and he writes about. I mean, one of his characters is an elephant, and I sometimes wonder whether that elephant is him. But he does it in such a beautiful way. I think it's now called Cozy, a Cozy or a Cozy Crime, and he does it brilliantly. He writes brilliantly, and I know him on a personal level, and he's not that nice when you meet him, as you know.
That's true.
Day to day, he's an awful person.
Yeah, he's not very likable.
He's not very likable at all. He looks very strange. I'm saying this tongue in cheek for anybody who doesn't know.
Yes.
And he writes so beautifully, much more beautifully than you'd expect. I love your books. I love all of your books, and again that evolution from Sophia Khan is Not Obliged, which is a kind of rom-com written now, which is the movement, not this idea of science, but the idea of how silence gives power and how it's been used as a tool of power. I think is incredible, and I'd love it if everybody read that book, because I think it's important.
Ladies and gentlemen, I did pay him to say that. So on that note,
I'm going to show you what you paid me. As you can see, it's a $1 million bill.
There we are. He is magic. Thank you so much, Imran, for talking about your wonderful books. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. But I hope to see you again soon.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you very much indeed to the Lahore Festival for inviting us on.